really get artists and scientists, discoverers like Galileo, Copernicus, or Leonardo da Vinci, who's both an artist and a scientist discoverer. But you also always, and literally always, get Lorenzo de Medici. He wasn't an artist, he wasn't a discoverer, but what he did was help boat groups and allowed them to flourish. They needed patrons, they needed sponsors, and he allowed them to flourish. To me, since I was a kid, I don't know why, I must have read a book, I have no idea, but I've been absolutely in love with Lorenzo de Medici. Although he's probably one of the ugliest men that ever lived. And I remember when I was at Florence, I don't know, I'll say 10 years ago, I can't remember. There's a whole avenue with statues of great people from Florence. And when I got in front of the statue of Lorenzo, I started crying. But this is not about Lorenzo, because I started, and I've done that last year, it happens all the time. I started wondering, okay, how did this family, the Medici, become so famous, so rich, so powerful in so little time? They were not from the warrior classes. They didn't have title, nothing like that, but they ended up being the richest people in Europe, richer than kings and counts and dukes. They produced 4 popes. They produced 2 very important queens of France. So how did that happen? How did a family like that eventually manage to become so powerful? And the answer is the wool trade, and I had no idea that was the case. Through Europe between 1150 and 1300, and 1300 is probably when you start thinking of the Medici, the population of Europe doubled from 38.5 million to about 73.5. And that had tons of effect. It increased, you needed agricultural, increased agriculture production. It led to the development and expansions of cities, because before that, it was basically a castle and a little group near the castle, but actual cities. Those cities became market centers, and what developed was a growing merchant population, and that's where the Medici come in. They were merchants. It's not only in Florence, obviously. It happened in Belgium, in Holland, in northern Italy. And the basis of a lot of that merchant, growing merchant population had to do with dyeing, weaving, and finishing woolen cloth. It had to do with wool. They would get the wool, a lot of it, not only, but a lot of it from England, and it would be processed in these centers, and eventually these centers would then start distributing the finished woolen products. The recorded Medici story starts in about 1150, when a couple of family members from a small village outside of Florence moved to Florence. They were wool merchants. They were wool. They produced wool, and eventually, obviously, everything expanded from there. At the height of the industry, and you're talking 1300, something like that, 1250, 1300, the wool group employed 30,000 workers. just in Florence, and about a third of Florence's population, and produced 100,000 lengths of wool cloth. I mean, it's quite incredible. So that's how they started. They started becoming rich through the wool trade. But then, obviously, because they were rich, because they'd managed to accumulate more money than they needed, it developed into banking. And ultimately, banking is what made the Medici what they were. Until, until about 1200, I think, banking didn't really exist, but the accumulation of money and the lending of money was solely in the hand of the Jews. It was seen as unacceptable for anybody to make any money out of lending money. The Jews were accepted from that, so they did. But finally, the Christian rulers saw the advantage of having a class of men outside of the Jews who could provide capital. So slowly the laws were changed, and it became possible for Christians to actually lend money, very frankly, at what we would say today, exorbitant interest. At some point, Florence tried to stop anything that would have been over 20% interest. But so slowly, non-Jews were allowed to not only accumulate money through this trade, but also to start lending money. And it became acceptable for them to actually get interest for it. Almost from the beginning, the greatest European bankers were Italians. I mean, I don't find anywhere which really explains why it particularly worked in Italy. But one of the reasons is probably that by the late 1200s, Italian bankers had become the fiscal agents of the Pope. And obviously, the Pope in Rome was probably one of the richest rulers. The Medicis were not involved right from the beginning. It was a couple of other families, the Bardi and the Peruzzi. They'd financed import of English cloth and the export of finished cloth. They'd advanced huge sums to the kings of England and France, in fact, based on that trade. And when Edward III defaulted on his debts, well, both families more or less collapsed. The risks of lending were great, but the profits were absolutely wonderful either. And bankers were not only lenders, they were money changers. They were the only people who could establish the relative value of the hundreds of coins that were in circulation. So, and they invented the transfer of money over, and we're talking about Italian bankers, the transfer of money over long distances by bills of exchange. Obviously, it wasn't just in Italy, and not only in Florence. Venice, Rome, Milan, Genoa were important. Avignon, Geneva, Bruges, and London also became great centers. So back to the Medici. They had accumulated all this money, and by 1397, and that's 50 years before Lorenzo the Medici is born, so at the time of his grandfather, basically they created, in 1397, they created the Medici Bank, which became one of the most prosperous but also respected institutions in Europe. Within about 30 years, even before Lorenzo took power, they were the wealthiest in Europe, and they remained that for quite a while. It's interesting, they were among the earlier businesses to use the general ledger system, which is kind of fun, and a double entry bookkeeping system for tracking credits and debits. Now, today you think of bankers as, well, my father was a banker, so I can say that, as relatively boring and staid people, but the relations were really not easy between the great banking families when this started. Before the Medici came on, there were a couple of other families that were more powerful than they were, and a number of things life was not easy. In 1433, for example, another banking family, the Albigi, managed to have Cosimo de Medici exiled. He came back the next year, having gotten lots of supporters. Then in 1478, again, a little bit before Lorenzo took control, there was an attempt to depose the Medici by killing Lorenzo and his younger brother during Easter services. His younger brother, Giuliano, was killed, and Lorenzo was injured. It included these other banking families, but sort of, in a way, more interested. The Pope, it was Sixtus IV, was involved. He wasn't directly involved, but he gave permission to the other families to do that and allowed the plot to proceed, and eventually gave dispensation for the crimes done while this was happening. So after the Pazzi attempt, the Medici definitely became the leading family in Florence, and they would hold that position for the next 3 centuries. Florence remained a republic until 1537, so they were never, until then, officially their leaders. They weren't counts, they weren't dukes, whatever, until then. And Florence was a republic, but it was very obvious that the town was under the control of the Medici. In fact, the Medici never really held any official posts in the Republic of Florence. By then, by Lorenzo's time, at least half of the population of Florence was employed by the Medici, and whether it was wool or the other branches of the family. Ultimately, there were 3, there's more, but there were 3 really well-known Medici leaders. The first who really created the dynasty is Giovanni de' Medici, and then his son Cosimo di Giovanni, and then his great-grandson, there was a small time between the 2, Lorenzo. By the time Giovanni, the first one, came to powers, they were basically related to every single elite family in Europe, true marriages of convenience, obviously true partnerships, true employment, and true, basically was what was a huge social network. Several families had access to the rest of the elite families, at least in Italy, only through the Medici. And as I said earlier, although they never really had official titles in the Florence Republic, it was definitely under the control. They became even richer in 1461 through, and I don't want to get into what it means, but through the discovery of vast deposits of alum in Italy. Don't ask, but alum is essential in the dyeing of certain cloths, and was used extensively in Florence, but also in the rest of Italy and the rest of Europe. Before the Medicis, the Turks were the only exporters of alum, so Europe had to buy this absolutely necessary ingredient from the Turks. And life is good. I wish I had some friends. Pius II granted the Medici family a monopoly on the mining. So basically making them the only people who could actually produce and sell alum. Ultimately, two things really destroyed the greatness of the Medici. They stayed rich. They became, in fact, more powerful to some extent. They were made nobles later on, etc. But ultimately, two things are important. Lorenzo de Medici, whom I admire and I think created almost unilaterally the Renaissance by paying for them and helping artists and helping discoverers, etc., basically paid, while he was in power, basically paid very little attention to the family business. He really was, he paid attention to the politics, and he paid attention to the art. And sort of to some extent lost a bit of control. It seems that the branch managers throughout Europe basically became inefficient, and he did lose a lot of money. After Giovanni de Medici, the first really well-known head of the family, came Cosimo the Elder, named father of the country, Pater Patria, and took over in 1434 as Gran Maestro, the unofficial head of the Republic. Then Piero, he was Lorenzo's father, and nicknamed Piero de Gouty because he had really bad gout, and that led to his death. He had little interest in the arts. His father and grandfather did, and to some extent did nothing for the art and did very little to further the Medici power, both in Florence and outside. So until Lorenzo, Piero de Gouty's son, the power sort of stagnated. Now we come to Lorenzo. Born, he wasn't, he was quite young when he died. He was born in 1449 and died in 1492. Lorenzo the Magnificent, as we've grown to know him, he was very capable as a ruler of the city, and did that. Remember, his brother had been killed by another family, and he'd been wounded, so he kept the power of the family in the town very, very seriously. But he did neglect the family banking business to some extent, and that made them ultimately somewhat less rich. Lorenzo was brilliant at every possible way, except maybe in business. To ensure the continuance of his family, he planned his children's future careers for them. He groomed Piero too, who was headstrong and okay, to follow as his successor in civil leadership. Giovanni was placed in the church at an early age and became the future Pope Leo X. His daughter Maddalena was provided a sumptuous dowry, I can imagine what it could have been, and made a politically advantageous marriage, as it says, to a son of Pope Innocent VIII. Yeah, son of a pope, powerful, and which cemented the alliance between the Medici and the leading Roman families. When Lorenzo died in 1492, and remember that date, it's basically when, more or less, it's at the time when America is discovered. It's at the time when a lot of discoveries are happening. His son Piero, who was an okay manager, but he proved incapable. There was the French invaded Italy in 1492, and he really had difficulty responding to that. So within 2 years, he was exiled and replaced with a Republican government. Piero's exile and the family's exile, not just him, lasted for 20 years until 1512. And then another branch of the family, those descended from Cosimo the Elder, were able to come back and to rule. And in 1437, were in fact made Dukes of Florence. They acquired that title of Dukes of Florence in 1532, and then in 1569 it became the Grand Duchy of Tuscany after Tuscany territory expanded. So we now have the Grand Dukes. Not very, about 60, 70 years after Lorenzo dies. And this multi-century rule was basically almost never interrupted. A couple of times, some anti-Medici factions took control of Florence a few times. Duke Alessandro was assassinated, the junior Medici branch took over, etc. But basically, they stayed in power until 1730, 1750. Florence was still powerful during that time. particularly during the early Grand Duke. But by 1700, basically the family and the town were bankrupt. I said earlier, I'm coming to the end, but I said earlier, what probably one remembers most is the fact that 4 popes in a very, very short period, 4 popes from the Medici family took power in Rome. And obviously, because Rome was probably the richest kingdom, if you want, having a Medici Pope certainly helped the Medici family. So you have Leo X, Clement VII, Pius IV, and Leo the 11th. So both of them, and that goes between 1475 and 1605, these 4 popes. And for me, because I'm French, the Medici became important to me through books by Alexandre Dumas, the author of The Three Musketeers, because he did write, and I must have read these books when I was about 12 years old. He did write about, and extensively, about 2 really important Medici queens in Europe. And they weren't just the wife of the king. They were, in fact, extraordinarily important in the history of France. The first one, Catherine of Medici, who became a widow quite quickly, and then the queen mother of 3 kings, one after the other. They all died without having children. Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III. So Catherine of Medici is a strong woman and is fascinating. And the other one is Mary of Medici, Marie de Medici. She married King Henry IV of France, and she also acted as regent for her son, Louis XIII, and eventually for her grandson, Louis XIV, the Sun King. Okay, any questions? That's it.
All right, thank you, Suzanne. I see here that David Murray raised his hand on here, so I can unmute you, David, if there was something you wanted to say. I'll do that now. If you didn't mean to do that, then you don't have to talk. I'll just let you talk. Did you have anything to add, David?
I would need to ask how I ask a question.
Oh, you just have to type it in the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your screen, or you can ask it now since you're unmuted.
Well, where do I find the Q&A box for future reference?
If you just put your mouse towards the bottom of the screen,
yes,
some little icons should pop up, and there's one that says Q&A.
Oh, I see. You type the question in there.
Yeah.
Or you can just ask it.
Yeah, now that you're on, you can ask it.
Well, I have, actually, Suzanne, I have no question to ask other than to congratulate you for doing what you have done. You were easy to follow. There was a logical sequence to what you said. And I encourage you for doing it again next year.
Thank you. I intend to do it, and I think next year I will talk about Lorenzo. Not just Lorenzo as a political leader, but Lorenzo, or as a banker, but the importance of Lorenzo for the Renaissance and for the arts. I mean, nobody, to me, Lorenzo single-handedly created the Renaissance because he supported so many people that made so many changes to our world.
Diane Kendall has a question, and you kind of just said this with Lorenzo, but what is the Medici family's greatest legacy? Is it the world of art? And maybe that is for Lorenzo, but maybe not the family as a whole.
Well, I think it's two things, and it's definitely the work of art. And it wasn't just Lorenzo. Lorenzo is the most famous, but both his father, his grandfather, his great-grandfathers started this. So they were patrons of the art for generations. So yes, and not just not just the art in terms of sculptures and painting, but they also encouraged scientists in a way. I'm not sure how you call people at that time, but sort of discoverers, etc. So the art certainly, but also in a way banking, exchanges, the start of a European market where people, and they weren't the only ones, but they certainly made it very important, where trade routes and exchange, etc., which made the cities important, which made the merchant class important as opposed to just the nobles and the warrior class. So not exclusively, but I think they also had a really important role in that opening of Europe.
Diane also wanted to know if you can find portraits of the Medici family anywhere.
Yeah, it's very easy to find portraits if you go on, if you Google it. You'll find portraits of absolutely every single one of them. Right to the end, right from the great grandfather to the end. Unfortunately, my adorable, loved Lorenzo was probably one of the ugliest men who ever lived. He ended up having about 10 children, but he was absolutely incredibly ugly.
I noticed that there's a show called Medici the Magnificent when I was looking it up. Have you seen that show?
Yeah, I haven't seen all of it. I've seen the first 3 or 4 episodes. What can well, this is the second or third series, and the first 2 were not that bad. This third one, which centers on Lorenzo, is an absolute and horrible disaster. First of all, Lorenzo is gorgeous. Lorenzo is also somebody who, he fights with his sword, etc. He really would not have done that. He had spires and people fighting for him. He wouldn't have done that. So no, the third series is great if you don't know anything about them, but it's absolutely horrible if you know anything about them. But it's like Alexandre Dumas. I mean, his novels with the Three Musketeers. It's not real life, so it's fine.
Craig Tallman says thank you. And at the start, you spoke about the doubling of Europe's population. But he says, but wasn't the 1100s to the 1300s the period of the various Black Plagues, which killed off a third of England's
population? There was the plague, but at the same time, what did happen, despite the plague, is that agricultural production, and I haven't researched that, so I'm not totally sure why this agricultural production increased so much, but the increase of the population was linked to increased agricultural production. I could research it, but I didn't, which then produced enough extra food per capita to be able to create centers of distribution, to create cities with a merchant class. Yeah, you're right. I mean, there's a problem, but it's still doubled.
Ted Rummel wants to know, was Lorenzo the greatest philanthropist in history? His support of the arts resonates today. There have been many fabulously rich people since Lorenzo, but almost none with such a legacy.
No, I think he really, really was. And I don't know. I don't know everybody. And there were a couple of popes, in fact, that were incredible supporters of the art. But there is definitely no question that Lorenzo was probably one of the greatest. Now, I remember thinking, oh God, what's his name? Okay, the richest man in the world right now lives in. When he first decided that he would leave his position and donate all his money to health. You know who I'm talking about.
The name's not coming to mind. If anyone else knows what Suzanne's talking about, put it in the chat.
Yeah, computers. He created that and then dropped it all and put all his fortune to health. And Bill Gates.
Oh, Bill Gates.
Yeah, Bill Gates. I remember at that time, and I don't feel that now, but I remember at that time, why don't you go to arts? Why don't you become today's Lorenzo? But I think he's done a great job with health. So thank you, Ted. Yes, Bill Gates.
Yes. Can I say something?
Yes.
Can I?
Yeah. Yep, go right ahead.
But a couple of things. First of all, to the whole audience, I think Suzanne is modest when she says her father was a banker. I think he was more than a banker. He was one of the most prominent bankers in Canada. And I think many of you, if you're old enough, have seen his name and signature on the notes of the Bank of Canada. I think he and the governor signed. So anyway, you're modest to say that. But one of the things I'd ask you to consider, and all people who are listening to this could consider for future F&I, how can we turn this talk about the Medicis into a subject about the growth of banking, and how this may have been the seed that permitted commercial banking and backed by wealth to be the capital behind the lending of money.
I'm not sure what you want us to do. I mean, I'd be fascinated by researching that. And yes, there is no question that Florence bankers, and particularly the Medici, created to some extent what we now call banking. Not quite, but to some extent. But what would you like to do?
I would like people who are listening to this, not just you, to consider as taking a topic for F&I. Remember, it's famous and influential people and events, to take the growth of banking as a topic for 2021.
Sure, I could be interested in doing that, definitely. I mean, my father obviously wanted me to become a banker, but I had no interest whatsoever. Yeah, I've always been interested. I could definitely look at that and figure out who were the important people. Obviously, Florence was the start of banking very much, but it then England eventually took over. There's no question.
Well, and the Rothschilds.
And the Rothschilds. Yep. Oh. I could do in 2 years. I would be fascinated by doing the Rothschilds.
Consider yourself booked.
There you go. So I think that's it for the questions. So thank you very much, Suzanne. As David mentioned, they're now working on the 2021 lineup of presentations for famous and infamous people and events. So if there's any topics out there that you want to explore more and want to present that have to do with famous or infamous people and events, just contact us and we'll get you in touch with David Murray and Elizabeth Surtees, and they can try and fit you into the schedule. The ones that we have that we're doing this year, this one with Suzanne was scheduled for this year, so we're trying it out online. I believe she might also do it live next year in one of the months. No.
Oh yes.
Different one, not the same.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Oh yes.
David says yes, so you guys can fight over it. But any of the ones that we haven't been able to do this year will be scheduled for their corresponding month in 2021. Hopefully we'll be able to do some later on this year. They do go every month until November. So we've, put on hold till the end of June, and then hopefully we can start picking some up in July and into the fall. If that doesn't happen, again, we'll just do them in 2021 in their corresponding month. And those are all listed on the museum's website. So our next webinar is going to be next week, Thursday, May 28th at 2 o'clock, same time. And we have another famous and infamous presentation. Ted Rumble, who's one of our board members, is going to be presenting on Dusko Popov. It's a presentation he has done before live, but I know many of you have not seen it. So we're looking forward to that. And I hope everyone has a great day, and I hope to see you here online next week. Thanks, guys.